Have you ever watched someone get humiliated in public, only to realize a moment too late that they were fighting a battle far bigger than you could see? Stick with me here, because what you're about to witness isn't just a story, it's a wake-up call. One woman left. One man stood silent. And when the truth came out, the room didn't just fall silent, it froze. Right now, you're here because something about that title pulled you in. Maybe it made you angry. Maybe it made you curious. But I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why this story matters. You'll get the full truth behind the food stamps, the laughter, and the medical report that changed everything. But more than that, you're going to walk away with a perspective most people never even consider. So don't click away, don't scroll, don't let this just be background noise. This one's different. This one's real. And it starts in a quiet grocery store on a Tuesday morning, where judgment came easy and understanding came too late. It was one of those early mornings where the store was mostly empty. The fluorescent lights made everything feel colder than it was, and the only sound was the hum of freezer doors opening and closing. You know the type. The kind of morning where people are half awake, trying to get through their grocery list before the day takes off. There, in aisle 5 near the cereal section, stood a man, thin, quiet, early 40s, with hollow cheeks and eyes that had seen too much. His clothes were clean but worn, shoes frayed at the edges, and in his cart were just the basics: milk, bread, rice, beans, eggs. Nothing fancy. Nothing extra. He moved slowly, deliberately, like every step cost him energy. His name was Marcus. And today was his first time using food stamps. He didn't want to be there. In fact, he'd spent nearly an hour in the parking lot, debating whether to walk in at all. But hunger doesn't wait for pride to pass. A few aisles over, Danielle was scrolling through her phone, sipping a Starbucks latte and pushing a cart half full of organic snacks and overpriced candles. She was one of those people who always dressed like she had somewhere important to be, even if she didn't. Hair done, nails flawless, designer sunglasses propped on her head even though she was indoors. She wasn't cruel by nature, but she had a sharp tongue, a quicker temper, and a habit of making herself feel better by looking down on others. In her world, people like Marcus weren't struggling, they were lazy. They were moochers. They were the reason her taxes were too high. Or so she believed. Until today. They met at the self-checkout, 2 stations apart. Marcus was hunched over, trying to scan his items and manage the EBT card he barely knew how to use. His hands trembled a little, and when the card reader beeped with an error, he froze. The machine gave a loud, indifferent tone, the kind that always feels louder when people are watching. He tried again. Another beep. Then again. The line behind him started growing. Danielle was in that line. And she was watching. Watching him fumble. Watching the cheap groceries on the belt. Watching the EBT logo flash on the screen. That was the moment she let out a laugh. Not loud, but sharp enough to cut. Sharp enough for him to hear. And then she said it. Oh, come on. If you can't afford food, maybe don't waste time shopping at places like this. Some of us have jobs to get to. Everyone heard it. The cashier froze. The old woman behind her looked down at the floor. Marcus didn't look up. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, still as stone, eyes fixed on the blinking screen. But something shifted in the air. You could feel it. The kind of tension that makes your skin crawl even if you're not part of it. Danielle smirked, like she thought she'd said something clever. But then, Marcus reached into his coat pocket. Slowly, carefully, like he'd rehearsed this moment in his mind 100 times. And what he pulled out wasn't money, wasn't a wallet, wasn't an excuse. It was a folded stack of papers. Medical papers. Thick. Official. And on the front page was a word that no one wants to see. Stage 4. Let me stop right here for a second. Because this is the moment that flipped everything upside down. And if you're still watching, then you know it's not about food stamps anymore. It's not about grocery stores or even a public embarrassment. It's about what happens when we judge people without knowing their story. It's about what we assume when we see someone struggle and what we never bother to ask. So hang in here with me, because over the next few minutes, you're going to hear the full story of Marcus, the man behind the EBT card, the silence, and that medical report. You're going to learn what led to that Tuesday morning and what happened after the truth came out. And trust me, it didn't end in that checkout line. Marcus wasn't always sick. He wasn't always struggling. In fact, just a few years before, he had a steady job, a small apartment, and a routine that worked. He wasn't rich, but he was proud. He fixed air conditioning units in the summer and heaters in the winter. He was the guy you called when your house felt like a sauna or an icebox. He liked the work. He liked being useful. But then he started losing weight. His appetite disappeared. The pain started in his back, then spread to his ribs. He thought it was just strain from lifting heavy equipment. Then came the fatigue, the coughing, the blood. By the time he saw a doctor, the news hit like a wrecking ball. Pancreatic cancer, late stage. Surgery wasn't an option. Chemo might buy him some time. And even that was a maybe. His job didn't offer sick leave. His savings were gone in a few months. Rent, medical bills, prescriptions, all piled up. Then came eviction. Then the shelter. Then food stamps. Now, I know some people watching this might be thinking, that's sad, but it's not my problem. Or, there are still scammers out there. And you're right, there are. But here's the catch. How do you tell the difference from a glance? From a cart full of groceries? From a moment at the register? You can't. And that's the whole point. Danielle didn't know Marcus's story. She didn't care to ask. She just saw the EBT card and made her judgment. But when he handed her that medical report, when she actually looked at it, something in her face cracked. Her smirk vanished. Her voice caught in her throat. Because in that stack of papers were CT scans, blood panels, hospital records, all stamped and signed. It was real. It was raw. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't have anything clever to say. Now, here's where it gets even deeper, and why you absolutely need to stick around. What happened next wasn't just unexpected, it was something no one in that store would ever forget. Not the cashier. Not the people in line. And definitely not Danielle. Because what Marcus did next turned the entire room upside down and forced every single person to rethink the way they saw people like him. People who are quietly holding their lives together with frayed string. People who never asked for pity, only patience. But I'm not going to give you that twist just yet. Because when it lands, it hits hard. And you need to understand exactly what's at stake before we go there. So, if you're still with me, thank you. That tells me something about you. It tells me you care. That you're not just here for drama or a viral clip. You're here because you know there's something beneath the surface, and you want the full truth. That's rare. And it's powerful. So here's my promise to you. If you stay with this video till the end, you'll walk away with more than just a story. You'll walk away seeing people a little differently. You'll recognize these moments in your own life, at the store, on the street, in line at the pharmacy, and you'll remember what happened here. Because Marcus wasn't just a man using food stamps. He was a reminder that judgment is easy, compassion is harder, but necessary, especially in a world where battles are often invisible. And just when you think the story is over, just when it seems like the lesson has been learned, Marcus opens his mouth for the first time. He speaks. And what he says to Danielle in that moment completely shatters everything she thought she knew. But what did he say? You'll find out in just a moment. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't lash out, and he didn't try to embarrass Danielle in return. That wasn't his way. Instead, he looked at her with an expression that was calm, too calm, and spoke with a quiet strength that cut through the tension like a knife. But before we reveal what he said, you need to know who he was beyond that grocery store moment. Because the truth is, Marcus's story didn't begin at that checkout line, and it certainly didn't end there. In fact, it started unraveling long before that day, through a series of painful, quiet events that would break most people. And if you're still watching, it's because you sense that. You know there's more beneath the surface. You want to understand how a man like Marcus ends up where he did, standing humiliated in a grocery store with only a stack of medical papers to explain himself. But the truth is more complicated than anyone could have guessed. 2 years earlier, Marcus lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet part of town. It wasn't flashy, but it was his. He shared it with his younger sister, April, and her son, Liam, who had just turned 9. April was going through a rough divorce at the time, and Marcus had stepped in without hesitation, giving them both a place to stay, offering stability in a world that had suddenly turned upside down. He worked long hours as a heating technician, did his own repairs around the house, even helped Liam with homework when April worked the night shift at the hospital. They weren't rich, but they were a family, and for a while, that was enough. But around the start of the pandemic, things began to shift. First came the hours getting cut back at work. Then the strange symptoms, night sweats, stomach pain, weight loss that seemed too fast to be healthy. Marcus brushed it off at first, blaming stress and long hours. He couldn't afford to stop working. Bills had to be paid. Liam needed shoes. April needed help. Taking a day off to see a doctor felt like a luxury. It wasn't until he collapsed on the job one afternoon, barely able to breathe, clutching his side in agony, that he was forced into a hospital room and faced with the diagnosis that would derail his entire life. Pancreatic cancer. Aggressive. Advanced. Survival rate brutally low. From that moment on, everything changed. Chemotherapy sessions replaced job sites. Medical bills piled up. The savings account he'd quietly built over years was drained in under 6 months. April tried to hold everything together, working extra shifts, helping Marcus to appointments, but it wasn't enough. They lost the apartment not long after. The landlord gave them a 2-week notice when rent fell behind. Friends helped where they could, couches, spare rooms, but eventually even those options ran dry. April moved in with a distant cousin 3 states away, trying to get Liam into a stable school district. Marcus didn't want to be a burden. He told her to go, promised he'd figure it out. But he didn't. Not really. He bounced between shelters and clinic waiting rooms, doing what he could to stay afloat. He wasn't asking for handouts. Just time. Just the chance to make it to the next round of treatment. But even that became harder as his body began to fail. Eventually, he signed up for SNAP benefits, what most people call food stamps. It was a blow to his pride, yes, but starvation had a way of stripping pride away piece by piece. He thought no one would notice. He thought he could just quietly get what he needed and leave. And that's what brought him to that grocery store, that self-checkout, and that moment when the woman behind him turned his silent struggle into a public spectacle. But here's where it gets strange. Because Marcus's decline wasn't just about illness. There were things that didn't quite add up. People he trusted started avoiding his calls. Letters from creditors showed up with charges he didn't recognize. His old job had promised to keep his position open, but when he tried to reach out, the number was disconnected. He heard rumors from a former coworker that someone had been using his old employee ID to clock hours at job sites. That same coworker claimed he saw Marcus's truck being driven by a stranger. But Marcus had sold that truck months ago, or at least he thought he had. He'd done the sale through someone he met at a clinic, another patient, a man named Richie, who offered to handle the paperwork for a small fee. Marcus was too sick to question it, too tired to think clearly. That's when things began to spiral faster. One morning, while waiting in line at a local food pantry, Marcus overheard 2 volunteers talking, one of them mentioning how they had flagged a man's name for suspicious activity involving benefits fraud. The name they mentioned? Marcus Jameson. His name. His identity. But Marcus knew he hadn't done anything wrong. He'd barely used his SNAP card more than a handful of times. He didn't know how someone could have gotten his information, but he knew one thing for sure, someone had. And whoever it was had been slowly poisoning what little safety net he had left. This is where the mystery begins to build. Because the more Marcus tried to untangle the web, the deeper it got. Records went missing. Emails to his caseworker bounced. The last doctor he saw suddenly left the clinic with no explanation. And the man named Richie? Gone. Phone number disconnected. No trace. What if this wasn't just bad luck? What if someone had deliberately set Marcus up, taken advantage of him while he was vulnerable, used his name, his ID, maybe even stolen benefits in his name? But who would do something like that? And why? Danielle, the woman who had mocked him in the grocery store, had no idea she had just stepped into a much bigger story. Because when Marcus handed her that stack of papers, it wasn't just his medical diagnosis. It was everything. Copies of fraudulent charges, letters to state agencies that went unanswered, records showing someone had used his name at clinics he'd never visited. Danielle didn't know any of that yet. All she saw was a man dying. But Marcus knew what he was doing. That confrontation wasn't just about shame. It was a calculated risk. He wanted attention. Because no one listens to quiet suffering. But they do listen when the spotlight is forced on them. And now Danielle and everyone around them was watching. You see, Marcus wasn't just a man with cancer. He was a man chasing truth in a system designed to bury people like him. And as the puzzle pieces started falling into place, something much darker began to emerge. Someone close to him, someone he once trusted, might be behind it all. But who? Was it Richie, the stranger from the clinic who helped sell the truck? Was it a former coworker, jealous or desperate enough to steal his identity? Or was it someone even closer, someone he never would have suspected? The deeper you go into this story, the more the lines blur. What started as a simple moment of public humiliation was just the surface layer of something far more twisted. Marcus wasn't just trying to survive cancer, he was trying to survive sabotage. And now, finally, someone was paying attention. The question is, was it too late? In the next part, you'll finally hear the words Marcus said that shatter Danielle's assumptions, and you'll learn why this seemingly small grocery store moment might have been the turning point in exposing something much bigger than anyone imagined. But for now, keep watching. Because just when you think you know where this is going, the story takes another sharp turn. And the truth? It's not what anyone expected. The air in Marcus's tiny room at the shelter felt heavier that night. He sat on the edge of the worn mattress, the edges of those crumpled documents still shaking in his hand. The confrontation at the grocery store had left a strange aftertaste. Not regret, not embarrassment, but something sharper. It was the feeling of being close to something real, something buried. For the first time in months, someone else had seen him. Not the struggling, skinny man swiping a food stamp card, but the person behind all the pain. Danielle may have mocked him at first, but her face had changed the moment she saw the first line on that report. Pancreatic adenocarcinoma, stage 3. She'd gone quiet. But it wasn't just the diagnosis that stunned her. It was everything else. The fraud alerts, the mismatched medical entries, the hospital visits logged under his name in cities he'd never stepped foot in. It didn't make sense. And the more he looked at it, the more Marcus realized it was never supposed to. The next morning, he headed to the local outreach office, clutching the manila folder that had become his lifeline. He asked to speak to Lydia, his caseworker, a woman who had once been warm and responsive during the early stages of his treatment. But when he gave her name to the receptionist, the response came back cold. Lydia no longer worked there. No explanation. No forwarding contact. Just a polite apology and a list of emergency resources stapled to a pink sheet. Marcus felt his stomach drop. Lydia had been the only one helping him submit appeals, tracking down billing errors, trying to resolve the identity issues in the state's benefit system. She had once promised she'd help get him a hearing with the State Department. And now she was gone without a trace. Frustrated but determined, Marcus headed to the public library, using their computers to access his old emails. But as he tried to log in, a red warning flashed across the screen. Your account has been locked due to suspicious activity.
Panic set in.
That email had everything: correspondence with Lydia, scanned forms, even the original PDFs of his medical reports. Without it, he had no proof. He asked the librarian if he could call support, and after a long hour on hold, a calm, robotic voice told him his identity couldn't be verified. It was as if the digital version of Marcus Jameson was slowly being erased, one click at a time. Then came the envelope. No return address. No postage. Just slipped under his shelter room door late at night. Inside was a single sheet of paper, neatly folded. In blocky, typewritten letters, it read, "Stop looking. Some things are better left buried." There was no signature. No clue. Just that short warning. Marcus stared at it for a long time, trying to decide if it was a threat, a joke, or something else entirely. But deep down, he knew. Someone was watching. Someone who wanted him to give up. To stop asking questions. to stop connecting the dots. But the more people tried to silence him, the more he knew he was getting close. He reached out to the only person who hadn't disappeared, an old friend named David from his days working in HVAC. They hadn't spoken in months, not since Marcus's diagnosis. David had always been loyal, a guy who'd covered for Marcus when he missed shifts, who used to bring him leftover meals from job sites. If anyone could help retrace the path, it was him. But when Marcus showed up at David's apartment, something felt off. David looked surprised to see him. Not shocked. Not warm. Just tense. His eyes darted toward the hallway like he was hiding something. And when Marcus started asking about Richie, the man from the clinic who'd handled the truck sale, David's face tightened. I don't know, man. Haven't seen him since last year. Just some guy hustling for meds. You sure that's his real name? David said, scratching the back of his neck. Pretty sure, Marcus replied. You introduced us, remember? There was a pause. A bit too long. Then David smiled awkwardly and shrugged. Did I? Sorry, memory's kind of fried these days. That was the moment Marcus knew something was wrong. David had introduced them. At the clinic's parking lot. He remembered the exact words. This guy helped me get my papers squared away. He can help you too. But now David was pretending it never happened.
Why?
Later that night, Marcus sat alone again, scanning through the one remaining document he had printed, an itemized billing statement from a medical center in Dallas, Texas, with his name at the top. The problem? He'd never been to Dallas. He flipped it over, tracing the dates. That same week, Marcus had been undergoing chemo in his own city, hundreds of miles away. It wasn't a clerical error. It was deliberate. Someone had walked into that clinic pretending to be him.
But why?
And more importantly, how? Then, just as Marcus began digging into the hospital's name, he made a chilling discovery. The attending physician listed on the fraudulent paperwork was a man named Dr. Alan Trask. That name wasn't unfamiliar. In fact, it brought back memories Marcus hadn't thought about in years. Specifically, the night his mother passed away from a medication error during a hospital stay nearly a decade earlier. She'd gone into a routine surgery and never came out. The hospital had launched an internal investigation, but the case was sealed with a settlement. No names were released publicly. But Marcus remembered the whispers. He remembered overhearing one of the nurses say it was Trask's mistake. Could it be the same man? The pieces didn't make sense yet, but they were beginning to form a shape. One that hinted at something far more dangerous than stolen benefits. This wasn't just about identity theft. It was about covering tracks. About someone with access, with knowledge, using Marcus's illness as a smokescreen for something bigger. Maybe medical billing fraud. Maybe patient swapping. Or something worse. He wasn't sure who to trust now. David was acting strange. Lydia had vanished. Richie wasn't real, or at least not who he said he was. And the deeper Marcus went, the clearer it became. This wasn't about him anymore. He had stumbled into something that connected his past to a growing corruption in the present. And somewhere in the middle of it, his name had become a mask for someone else's crimes. But then, just as he began reaching out to a local investigative journalist, a woman named Tara who'd written exposés on healthcare scams, something else happened. His shelter room was searched. Nothing was missing, but his remaining documents had been moved.
Touched.
His manila folder, which never left the side of his mattress, was lying open on the floor. And at the bottom, under the pages, was something that wasn't his. A hospital badge. One with his name, but not his face. And that's when everything changed. The plastic badge felt ice cold in Marcus's hand, but it wasn't just the chill of the night air that sent a tremor down his spine. It was the face staring back at him. Clean-shaven, brown-eyed, with a surgically precise smile, the man on the badge looked like a corporate ghost, dressed in scrubs and attached to a hospital Marcus had never visited. Yet the name below the photo was unmistakable. Marcus D. Jameson. His birthday. His medical ID. Even the barcode, when scanned on a borrowed phone app, pinged active in a hospital system over 400 miles away. That's when Marcus knew this wasn't a case of random identity theft or a stolen wallet. This was strategic. Clinical. Coordinated. Someone had created a second Marcus. And whoever he was, he had access to medical facilities, electronic systems, and a life that wasn't his to live. Before Marcus could process what this meant, his prepaid phone buzzed on the mattress. The screen flashed a name he hadn't seen in months. Ava. She had been a volunteer nurse at the same treatment clinic where Marcus received his initial diagnosis. Kind, soft-spoken, and always slipping him extra juice boxes after chemo sessions, Ava had left the clinic abruptly just 2 months prior. No goodbye, no farewell shift, nothing. At the time, Marcus had assumed she'd moved on to a better-paying job. But now, as her name blinked on his screen, he realized her absence was part of a much bigger puzzle. He answered. Her voice was rushed, panicked. Marcus, it's Ava. I know it's been a while, but I think something's happening. I found a letter. At my apartment. Marcus sat up, instantly alert. What kind of letter? There was a pause on the line, then a trembling breath. It had your name on it, but it wasn't meant for me. It was tucked behind my mirror, like someone wanted me to find it later. There's a picture in it.
Of us.
You and me, outside the clinic. And someone circled your face in red ink. Marcus's pulse pounded in his ears. Ava, did anyone see you find it? I don't know. I don't think so. But that's not all, she continued, her voice cracking. The letter said to stop asking questions. That patients don't live long enough to notice billing changes. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just about using his name for prescriptions or checkups. This was about monetizing patient identities in the final stages of life. No one looks closely at the dying. No one audits a system if the victim won't be around to file complaints. Marcus realized he was part of a pool, a small group of terminally ill individuals whose data was being used by someone else, possibly a network, to carry out fraudulent medical procedures, false insurance claims, maybe even experimental treatments using aliases. It was chilling. The next day, Marcus and Ava met in a diner on the outskirts of town, one of the few places that still accepted cash and didn't ask questions. She looked thinner, more fragile than he remembered, her nurse's uniform swapped for a hoodie and jeans. She pulled out the envelope and slid it across the table. Inside was not only the photo, but a printout of an internal report listing dozens of patient accounts flagged as inactive and then suddenly reactivated days or weeks before their deaths. At the top of the list was a familiar name, Lydia Tran, his old caseworker. Ava leaned in, her voice a whisper. I looked up her license. She didn't just quit. She was terminated. Hospital billing fraud investigation. They claimed she altered records. But I don't think she was stealing. I think she was trying to expose it. Marcus scanned the list again, noticing dates and codes he'd seen before. Many matched hospital visits he never made. But as they pieced together more timelines, something else stood out. Not all the flagged patients had died. A few names were still marked active, and one of them was a man named Nolan Reyes, a former veteran with stage 4 liver cancer who Marcus had met briefly during a clinic support group session. Nolan had vanished months ago, and everyone assumed the worst. But according to this list, Nolan was alive. Not only that, but he had been checked into 3 different hospitals under 3 different insurance plans in the past 8 weeks. Either someone had completely fabricated his death, or Nolan was a part of this, willingly or not. Marcus tracked down the last hospital listed under Nolan's name, Rehabilitation Center Upstate. When he called pretending to be a cousin, the woman on the phone sounded hesitant but confirmed that Mr. Reyes was discharged 2 days ago. Discharged to where? No one could say. The more Marcus asked, the more doors slammed shut. That night, he and Ava split ways for safety, promising to meet again after she contacted a retired hospital administrator she trusted, someone she believed might have once suspected this scheme, but never had proof. But the following morning, Marcus awoke to find another envelope, this time shoved under the entrance door of the shelter. There was no note, just a single printed photo inside, a security camera still frame. It showed Ava walking into the diner the night before, and behind her, barely visible in the reflection of the glass door, stood the same man from the hospital badge. The fake Marcus. Watching. Now Marcus wasn't sure what to believe. Was the imposter following them? Was Ava being tracked? Or worse, was she part of it all and pretending to be scared to lure him into something bigger? The more he thought about it, the more paranoia seeped in. He wanted to trust her, needed someone on his side, but if the enemy was erasing people's identities and replacing them with ghosts in the system, how could he be sure of anyone? And then came the final blow. As he returned to his shelter room that night, he found it emptied. Everything gone. His clothes, his folder, his mattress, completely stripped. When he asked the staff, they looked confused. "Sir, you checked out this morning. Said you were transferring to inpatient care." Except he hadn't. Whoever had taken his identity hadn't stopped at records. They were now walking in his shoes, making moves in real time. If someone else was pretending to be Marcus Jameson in public, it meant he was running out of time to stay ahead. His life was being rewritten, one hospital form and forged ID at a time. And somewhere out there, someone was living as him, better, cleaner, more believable. And they had just erased the real Marcus Jameson. Marcus had always believed that fear was a temporary thing, something sharp and sudden that passed after a moment. But this fear, this new fear, was different. It wasn't a flash. It was a slow, tightening grip, the kind that wrapped around your chest and never let go. That night, walking through the cracked sidewalks of the city with the wind hissing between buildings like a warning, Marcus realized he was being followed. It wasn't a feeling born from paranoia or stress. It was something deeper. The rhythmic sound of footsteps behind him never matched the shuffle of other pedestrians. They stopped when he stopped, sped up when he turned corners. Whoever it was, they weren't hiding. They wanted him to know. It was a game, one he hadn't agreed to play. He ducked into a convenience store and lingered near the back, pretending to look at cereal boxes while watching the reflection in the window of the refrigerator door. A man in a hood stood just outside the store, motionless, facing the glass, as if waiting. Marcus didn't recognize the face, if there even was one under the shadows, but something about the posture felt familiar. Too confident. Too calm. Like someone who already knew what you were going to do before you did it. He waited there for 10 minutes, hoping the figure would disappear, but it never moved. It just stayed there, watching. When Marcus finally left out the back exit into the alleyway, his hands were trembling. By the time he reached the edge of town, where an old friend had promised him a safe couch for a few nights, the sense of being hunted hadn't faded. But what shattered him came not from a dark alley or a shadowy stranger. It came from his phone. A message. Just 3 words.
"She's not safe."
There was no sender ID. Just those words, and an attached photo. Ava's apartment, with the lights out and the front door left ajar. His stomach dropped. He tried calling her, but it went straight to voicemail. He called again. Nothing. Again. Still nothing. Marcus wasted no time. He cut across town on foot, adrenaline overriding the fatigue in his body. He reached Ava's street just after midnight, only to find the building dark and quiet. The front entrance was open, unlocked. Her door, too, just like the picture. Inside, the apartment was a mess. Furniture overturned. Books scattered. Her laptop was gone. Drawers were open, clothes thrown everywhere, but oddly, no signs of struggle. It looked less like a robbery and more like someone searching for something in a hurry. On the kitchen counter was a single sticky note. One word.
Run.
He stood in that silence, surrounded by the absence of her presence, and felt the weight of something far more sinister than a simple conspiracy. Whoever was behind this knew where she lived. They knew her connection to Marcus. They had watched them at the diner, followed them across the city, and now she was gone. Whether she had fled or been taken, he didn't know, but the one person who had helped him navigate the edges of this nightmare had vanished, and he was completely alone again. The weight of it began to crack him from the inside out. As he walked the empty streets, the guilt settled like fog over his shoulders. Was it his fault? Had bringing her into this dragged her into something that couldn't be undone? He remembered her kindness in the clinic, how she used to check on him even when he wasn't on her rounds. She had once told him that working with cancer patients reminded her of her father, another man taken too early by a system that saw dollar signs instead of dignity. And now Marcus feared she might become just another name on the list. Just another flag in a spreadsheet. Another ghost. In the hours that followed, Marcus began questioning everything. He returned to the rehab center where Nolan Reyes had supposedly been discharged, but the address listed online led to an abandoned building. Windows boarded. Grass growing through the cracked pavement. No staff. No sign of activity. As he stood there staring at the lifeless facade, a man in scrubs exited the side door, looked directly at Marcus, then disappeared around the corner without a word. It wasn't just eerie, it felt orchestrated. Like every move Marcus made was being countered in real time, like he was chasing shadows that always stayed just out of reach. But something changed in him after Ava's disappearance. The fear didn't go away, but it sharpened. Became fuel. He knew now that this wasn't just about him. Whoever was behind this didn't just want to use dying people as puppets. They wanted to erase the ones who knew too much. He had stumbled into a black hole of identity theft, insurance fraud, and possibly something even more corrupt buried deep within the healthcare system. The fake badge, the missing records, the altered files. It wasn't just about money. It was about manipulation at a level that demanded silence. That night, Marcus made a decision that would mark a point of no return. He bought a burner phone and sent a single text to a local journalist who had once been threatened into dropping a story about hospital billing schemes. Her name was Tara King, and she had gone dark after a lawsuit had nearly ruined her career. But Marcus had heard whispers from other patients at the clinic that she was still out there, waiting for the right story. The text simply read, "I know what happened to Nolan Reyes. I need your help before I disappear too." And then, just before midnight, he received a response. It wasn't from Tara. It was from his old email address, the one that had been shut down weeks ago. The message read, "You're not who you think you are." And attached was a childhood photo of him, one he had never seen before. One where he was standing next to a man he didn't recognize, wearing the same hospital badge. Marcus couldn't stop staring at the photo. It looked authentic, aged, slightly yellowed, creased at the corner, but it wasn't just the paper that chilled him. It was the moment it had captured. In the image, he stood as a child, maybe 5 or 6, holding hands with a man who wore a white coat and hospital badge. The man wasn't smiling. His expression was blank, clinical, eyes trained on the camera as if daring whoever was behind the lens to challenge him. But what truly sent ice through Marcus's spine wasn't the man. It was the name on the badge, partly obscured but still legible. Dr. Isaac Bell. Marcus had seen that name before. On the financial report Ava had shown him. On the insurance documents tied to Nolan Reyes. On the license plate registry connected to the black SUV that had tailed him weeks ago. He thought he'd been tracking a faceless conspiracy, but now it had a name. And a face. One Marcus had apparently met long before he ever got sick. In a panic, Marcus turned to the few belongings he had left. Old files, childhood records, medical transcripts. And that's when he saw it. A name change form tucked inside his foster care paperwork. It was subtle, barely noticeable unless you knew what you were looking for. At age 7, after his parents died in what had always been described to him as a car accident, Marcus had been assigned a new legal guardian. The name listed? Isaac Bell. The very same doctor who had vanished from public records 15 years ago after being investigated for performing unauthorized experimental treatments on terminal patients. Marcus hadn't been adopted out of kindness. He had been selected. Groomed. Observed from the very beginning. The betrayal cracked something inside him. All this time, he thought he was just a victim of circumstance, a man thrown into poverty by cancer and corruption. But now the narrative had flipped. He wasn't a random name on a spreadsheet. He was part of the story. A living asset in a decades-old experiment. The clinic he thought had saved his life was just another chapter in a carefully orchestrated trial. The food stamps, the fake prescriptions, the experimental treatments, the disappearances, it had all been designed to monitor the effects of controlled deprivation and desperation on a human subject. Marcus hadn't been surviving the system. He was the system. Desperate for clarity, Marcus took a chance and used the burner phone to call Tara King again, hoping to finally reach the journalist. This time, someone answered. But it wasn't Tara. It was a man's voice, calm, unbothered, and eerily familiar. "You're asking the wrong questions, Marcus. You're not looking for who hurt you. You're looking for why you were chosen." Then the call disconnected. Feeling cornered, Marcus returned to the last place he hadn't dared to visit, the home of his old foster brother, Devin. They hadn't spoken in years, not since a fight that ended in police involvement. But Devin had always kept to himself, living off the grid, refusing any connection to the medical system. When Marcus arrived, Devin was hesitant at first, clearly on edge, but once he saw the photo, his entire demeanor changed. He led Marcus inside, locked 3 different bolts behind them, and sat him down at a table covered in old photographs and newspaper clippings. "I was wondering when they'd come for you too," Devin muttered. "They used to come for me in my sleep. Needles, questions, pills I wasn't supposed to take. You don't remember it, but we were all part of something back then. A group. Kids with no families. No voices. We were test subjects, Marcus. You and me and others like us. They called it Project Nightfall." Marcus had never heard of it. But Devin had everything. Names, files, old consent forms signed by people who didn't exist. The deeper Marcus read, the more the pieces clicked into place. Project Nightfall was a covert study conducted under the guise of pediatric cancer care, funded by a private arm of a biotech company that no longer existed under the same name. The goal wasn't to cure patients. It was to study how much suffering a human could endure when left without support, medical access, or dignity. It wasn't science. It was cruelty wrapped in clinical language. And the worst part? Ava had unknowingly been aiding it. Marcus remembered the folder she once showed him, the one she said she couldn't access beyond a certain point. It hadn't been locked because of security clearance. It had been locked to protect a legacy. Ava's father was Isaac Bell. The ground fell out from beneath Marcus. The woman who had helped him survive, the one person who seemed genuinely good, had been carrying the bloodline of the man who orchestrated everything. Whether she knew the full story or not, Marcus couldn't be sure, but the possibility alone split his trust wide open. Had her kindness been real? Or just another layer of observation? Another variable? Before he could even decide what to believe, Devin's window shattered. A single bullet hole appeared in the glass, followed by a low, whirring sound.
Drones.
Not the kind kids flew in parks. These were equipped with surveillance cameras, infrared sensors, and more. Marcus grabbed the folder of documents, and he and Devin sprinted out the back just as a second drone began scanning the yard. Someone had been watching all along. Not just Marcus. Not just Ava. Everyone. As they vanished into the woods beyond Devin's property, Marcus realized the truth was far more twisted than he had imagined. He wasn't just up against a broken healthcare system or a few corrupt doctors. He was up against a legacy of calculated manipulation that had started long before he ever stepped into that grocery store with food stamps in hand. And worst of all, he might be the final piece they needed to bring the experiment full circle. Devin's truck roared down the desolate back roads as Marcus sat in the passenger seat, heart hammering against his ribs, gripping the stolen folder like it was the last piece of solid ground in a world collapsing beneath his feet. The files inside were damning. Evidence that could expose decades of secret medical trials, financial fraud, and systemic abuse buried under corporate mergers and nonprofit facades. But evidence didn't mean safety. In fact, it made them targets. And as they drove past the same nondescript buildings they'd once believed were just grocery stores, clinics, or federal offices, Marcus realized how invisible power had been weaponized right under the public's nose. What looked like routine parts of society were laced with secrets, surveillance, and systems designed to monitor outliers like him. The plan was to meet Ava, confront her, not accuse. At least, that's what Marcus kept telling himself. Maybe she didn't know the truth. Maybe she had been manipulated too, just like him. But deep down, a voice gnawed at him. What if she knew and stayed silent because it was safer? What if her care, her support, her perfectly timed appearances weren't acts of compassion, but assignments? By the time they reached the safe house Devin had set up, a converted storage facility with blackout curtains and signal jammers, Marcus had convinced himself this was the only way. He had to talk to her. He had to know. He called from a burner, voice shaking. She answered immediately. No hesitation. No questions. Just a quiet, "Where are you?" When she arrived hours later, hood pulled low over her head, Ava looked different, tired, frayed, and hesitant in a way he hadn't seen before. She glanced at Devon, then at the files scattered across the table. Her eyes widened when she saw her father's name. That's when Marcus saw it, not guilt, but recognition. That flicker of familiarity that only came when the mind was connecting threads it had long ignored. She wasn't shocked by the information. She was shocked it had resurfaced. "I didn't know everything," she said quietly, as Marcus stood like a statue in front of her. "But I knew enough to walk away." That sentence cracked him open. "What do you mean walk away?" he asked, voice low, every syllable steeped in betrayal. She hesitated, then pulled out her phone and showed him a message. It was dated 3 years ago. An anonymous text with coordinates, a warning, and one chilling line. "If you keep digging, he dies like the others." The message was sent the day Marcus had his first medical emergency and was admitted to the trial clinic. Ava had been in the system longer than she admitted. She had been following his case, watching from the shadows, protecting him, or so she thought. But protection had a cost. In exchange for her silence, she was allowed to stay close. She had made a deal. One that had kept him alive, but buried the truth. Marcus couldn't decide what hurt more, the lies she kept or the reasons behind them. The room spun with moral ambiguity. Devon watched from the shadows, arms crossed, jaw tight, the look of someone who'd been betrayed one too many times to believe in redemption anymore. Then came the ultimatum. Ava revealed she'd been contacted again, this time with a deal directly for Marcus. If he stopped his search, destroyed the files, and publicly withdrew any accusations against the clinic, he would be granted access to an elite treatment program that could reverse the damage from his cancer treatments, improve his health, and even reinstate his benefits. In other words, they would give him his life back, but only if he gave up the truth. The weight of the choice nearly crushed him. He could live, really live, not just survive, without food stamps, without being followed, without having to run. He could sleep in a bed, not watch over his shoulder, and reclaim the years that had been stolen from him.
But the truth would die.
And so would every other forgotten patient who didn't have a Devon, an Ava, or even a voice. He knew what they were offering wasn't charity, it was silence for sale. And they knew exactly what kind of man they were bargaining with. For hours, Marcus said nothing. He paced, stared at the ceiling, revisited every memory he had of lying in hospital beds, of applying for assistance, of being judged in grocery stores for using EBT, of being laughed at by people who saw a lazy man, not a broken one. And somewhere in that swirl of anger and grief, he saw something else, a little boy standing next to a doctor in a white coat. He remembered the photo. He remembered the hollow smile. He remembered that, even then, he had been chosen, not for kindness, but for cruelty. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "If I take their deal, I get my life back. But I let them keep doing this to others. If I expose them, I lose everything. But maybe someone else finally gets to live." Ava's eyes brimmed with tears. "I wish there was a third option. But there wasn't. That was the point. They had designed it that way." Before Marcus could decide, another message came through. Not to his phone, but to Devon's emergency line, the one only 3 people had access to. A new player had entered the game. Someone who claimed to have been inside Project Nightfall. Someone who said they had a list, names, dates, even locations of other living subjects. Survivors. Test cases. People just like Marcus. And they were willing to talk. But only in person. And only if Marcus came alone. The next morning felt different. The air itself seemed heavier, charged with the kind of tension that clings to your skin before a thunderstorm. Marcus could feel at the moment he stepped out of the safe house and into the narrow alley behind the building. Every shadow looked suspicious. Every passing car made his stomach knot. The world was watching, even if it pretended not to be. He tightened the zipper of his jacket and tucked the burner phone deeper into his pocket. Devon stayed behind this time, not out of choice but because whoever had contacted them made it clear. Marcus had to come alone. The address led him to a forgotten part of town, industrial blocks littered with half-collapsed warehouses and rusted-out trucks that hadn't moved in decades. He followed a cracked sidewalk until he reached a gate with a chain hanging loose. Beyond it, a figure waited, seated on a folding chair in front of a storage unit, smoking something hand-rolled and bitter-smelling. The man looked like he'd crawled out of a war, face weathered, one arm in a sling, scars too precise to be accidental. When Marcus approached, the man simply nodded and gestured toward the unit behind him. "I'm not here to hurt you," the man said. "I'm here to show you how deep the hole goes." Inside the storage unit was a makeshift command center, maps, medical files, photos pinned with string, hard drives, and a single laptop glowing with a login screen already bypassed. On it were names. Dozens at first, then hundreds. Each entry detailed dates of treatments, case numbers, failed experiments, and the companies funding them. But this wasn't just about Marcus anymore. His case file was one of many. Some were from different states, others from overseas. Each one marked under the same program codename, Nightfall. But now there were subcategories, variants, different branches operating under different shell organizations, many of them registered as nonprofit wellness clinics, government-subsidized health initiatives, or research partnerships between biotech companies and the Department of Defense. "They used us," the man said, voice steady but thick with rage. "Some of us for medical trials, others as psychological studies. Some were just data farms. You were in the control group. That's why you didn't die." Marcus felt like he was drowning. He backed away from the table, eyes wide, throat dry. He knew they were hiding something, but this was nationwide, multinational, coordinated, hidden in plain sight. And the worst part, he recognized more names. Not just patients, donors, politicians, people he'd seen on the news. Advocates who had pushed for better healthcare funding, only to reroute those funds back into the same system that had destroyed lives like his. And then came the blow that nearly broke him. Ava's name was on the list. Not as a victim, as a liaison. One of the first-tier informants trained to monitor subjects for behavioral irregularities. She wasn't just someone who had made a deal to protect Marcus. She had been embedded long before she even met him. According to the records, she had been assigned to him after his initial recovery. Everything, the coffee shop encounter, the kindness, the way she always seemed to show up when he needed someone, had been orchestrated. She had been given a script, and she had followed it. The man watched Marcus as his knees buckled, and he fell into the nearest chair. "I figured you didn't know," the man said softly. "But you had to find out eventually. She wasn't the only one. People you trusted, your first doctor, the social worker who helped with your Medicaid appeal, even the case manager who gave you the food stamps. All placed. All part of the monitoring process. It's how they kept tabs on progress. They never planned to let any of you live long enough to ask questions." Marcus couldn't speak. His body shook with fury, betrayal, and the sickening realization that everything he thought was real had been manipulated from the start. He'd spent years thinking he was struggling because of poverty, because of bad luck, because he didn't work hard enough. But the truth was, he had been chosen to fail. "They need you to stay quiet now more than ever," the man said, leaning closer. "Because the next phase is already in motion. The new group? They're children. Born into it. Genetically marked. They're using schools to test them under the guise of learning disabilities and behavioral studies. That's why they wanted you out of the way." That was the moment the urgency set in. This wasn't about Marcus anymore. This wasn't even about exposing one conspiracy. It was about stopping a machine that had been operating for decades under the noses of the American public. One that used trending buzzwords like health equity, innovative medicine, and underserved communities to disguise experimentation and surveillance. If they could silence him, the machine would keep running. But if he exposed them, even a piece of it, it might jam the gears. It might be enough to start the avalanche. Marcus stood up, jaw clenched, tears burning behind his eyes. He didn't know how much time he had left. But he knew one thing for certain now. He couldn't trust anyone, not even the people who said they were on his side. And with the files in hand, a list of names to protect, and the threat of a new generation being pulled into the same nightmare, Marcus knew the clock had started ticking. And just as he stepped back into the light of the alley, his phone buzzed. It was a live feed from Devon's safe house. The place had been ransacked. The screen went black. It all came down to this moment. The city's skyline loomed in the background, glowing with a false sense of calm as Marcus stood just outside the broadcast tower downtown, a sealed manila envelope clutched tight under his coat. His breath came heavy and short, clouding in the cold air, heart pounding not just with fear but with the weight of knowing too much. Inside the envelope was the final puzzle piece, an internal memorandum, signed and time-stamped, linking Nightfall to a conglomerate of biotech companies and political figures who had been orchestrating the entire operation under the guise of mental wellness grants. A program that was supposed to help low-income individuals on government assistance, but in truth, it had been a massive data harvesting initiative targeting the country's most vulnerable. And the worst part? The trial phase was over. Now they were preparing for national implementation. The tower's access was secure, but not impenetrable. Devon, though bruised and shaken from the earlier attack, had managed to recover the feed logs and loop the tower's internal security system for exactly 6 minutes. That was all the time Marcus had to get inside the control room and upload the documents through the network tied into the local news station's emergency broadcast system. The plan was simple, but the execution was a tightrope walk over a pit of knives. Marcus wasn't just fighting for truth anymore. He was fighting to stop the biggest betrayal of public trust the country had never heard of. As he slipped through the metal doors and climbed the dark stairwell, every creak of the steps beneath him sounded like thunder. His mind was spiraling with images. Ava's face when she confessed, the scarred man in the storage unit, the lists of names, the children being catalogued without their parents ever knowing. But none of that could distract him now. Because just as he reached the final level and stepped into the control hub, he wasn't alone. She was waiting. Ava stood by the console, hands folded, calm like the eye of a storm. Dressed in black, no trace of the warm person Marcus once trusted. There was no security team with her, no men in black suits or dark SUVs parked outside. Just her, standing between him and the truth. "I knew you'd come here," she said, softly but without remorse. "You're predictable, Marcus. That's why you were selected." Marcus froze. Her voice didn't even tremble. No guilt. No fear. Just the cold detachment of someone who had played both sides too long to remember which one she started on. "I trusted you," he said, his voice shaking, hands trembling as they hovered near the upload panel. "Was any of it real?" Ava looked away, and for a fraction of a second, something human flickered in her eyes. "We were told you'd be monitored. That's all it was supposed to be. No contact. No personal involvement. But you weren't like the others. You fought harder. You remembered. You asked questions." "Then why not help me?" he demanded, stepping closer, rage building like pressure behind a dam. "You could have exposed this years ago." "Because they would have killed me," she snapped back. "And because it was bigger than you think. Bigger than either of us. You think leaking that file will bring them down? It won't. They'll bury it under headlines, fake news, smear campaigns. You'll be painted as unstable, just another disgruntled case study with a victim complex. That file isn't enough, Marcus. It never was." Then she did something unexpected. She stepped aside. "There's something else you need to see," she said, sliding a flash drive from her sleeve and placing it on the console. "Real-time footage. Hidden archives. Off-the-books interviews. Proof they can't deny. It's not just Nightfall. It's hospitals, insurance companies, behavioral testing centers. All tied together through a digital platform disguised as a wellness app downloaded by over 5 million people. Every click, every conversation logged." Marcus stared at her, heart thundering louder than his thoughts. He didn't know if he could believe her again, but he didn't have time to debate. He took the flash drive and inserted it into the system. The screen lit up, floodgates opening with a torrent of evidence, each file validating the others. And as the data uploaded and began feeding directly into the live emergency broadcast system, Marcus caught sight of the time left, 2 minutes before the security system came back online. Then the final twist hit like a sucker punch. On one of the video files, dated just a year ago, a hidden recording showed a panel of officials discussing long-term social conditioning using targeted deprivation. And among them, clearly visible and speaking without hesitation, was Marcus's original therapist, the man who had convinced him to accept government assistance in the first place. The same man who had disappeared a month before Marcus's collapse, now shown as a lead architect in manipulating the behavioral responses of low-income individuals for market research. The betrayal ran deeper than Marcus could have imagined. His entire descent hadn't been coincidence. It had been manufactured. The file finished uploading. The screen went black. Then suddenly, live footage began broadcasting across dozens of network affiliates, hijacking airwaves and mobile networks, playing back files and images in rapid succession. It was chaos in motion, but it was working. Ava stepped back, watching it unfold like someone watching a dam finally break. "You just started a war," she said quietly. Marcus turned to her, eyes burning. "Then let's make sure it's one they lose." But just as they made to leave, a red light flashed above the exit door. The security system had detected them. They were locked in. Sirens blared. For 2 days, the country was frozen in a kind of digital paralysis. Phones buzzed with notifications, televisions were hijacked mid-broadcast, and screens in airports, offices, even Times Square displayed chilling footage of boardroom meetings, secret trials, and biometric databanks linked directly to government-issued food assistance programs. The public reaction was immediate, explosive, and overwhelming. Protesters flooded the streets from Chicago to Atlanta, waving signs demanding accountability and transparency. Politicians scrambled to distance themselves from the exposure, while federal agencies launched internal investigations to stem the bleeding. The term nightfall trended at #1 on every major platform, next to keywords like surveillance state, food stamp corruption, and government betrayal. It was no longer a fringe conspiracy whispered in dark corners. It was out in the open, raw and undeniable, and the people were awake. But Marcus didn't get to see the eruption unfold from a safe distance. By the time federal investigators arrived at the broadcast tower, the control room was empty. The hard drives were wiped, security cameras disabled, and no sign of forced entry remained. Some believed he'd escaped through a maintenance tunnel beneath the building. Others thought he was taken or silenced before he could talk. But the truth was far more complex. Marcus had slipped into the shadows of the very system he had just exposed. No longer a victim, no longer a pawn, he had become the ghost in the machine. He left behind no digital footprint, no known alias, only fragments of his existence scattered through encrypted forums and leaked documents. To the public, he was a faceless whistleblower. To the people who had followed his story online, he was a hero. But to those who really knew him, he was just a man trying to reclaim the life stolen from him one piece at a time. Ava, meanwhile, disappeared in her own way. She wasn't seen on the news, wasn't named in any official report. Some claimed she resurfaced in Montana under a new identity. Others believed she turned witness and entered protection. But a blurry photo leaked online weeks later. Her profile framed in a cafe window, face turned slightly, eyes distant. And underneath the post, thousands of comments debated her loyalty, her motives, and whether she'd been part of the solution or the problem. No one could agree, and maybe that's how she wanted it. Her role in all of it remained a quiet storm, devastating, but hard to pin down. In the months that followed, congressional hearings were broadcast nationwide, featuring whistleblowers, tech engineers, and former executives now eager to flip for leniency. Companies rebranded overnight, stock prices tanked, and several high-ranking officials resigned under the heat of federal indictments. Laws were proposed, some passed, others buried, and a national debate erupted over how much control private industries should have over public welfare systems. But perhaps the most haunting effect was the psychological one. People began to look differently at the devices in their pockets, the apps they downloaded, the permissions they granted without reading. Parents deleted tracking apps off their kids' phones, grocery stores installed offline payment kiosks, and conversations about privacy became mainstream. It wasn't about paranoia anymore. It was about protection. And yet, even with the storm behind them, the scars remained. Marcus's mother, who had quietly watched the coverage from a senior home in Cincinnati, kept a framed photo of her son on her nightstand, young, smiling, untouched by what would eventually unravel his world. She didn't need the media to tell her what he'd done. She had always known there was more to his story than anyone gave him credit for. Her son, once mocked at a checkout line for using food stamps, had become the catalyst for one of the biggest social reckonings in modern American history. And though she hadn't heard his voice since that night, she kept his last letter tucked in her Bible, where he promised he was safe and doing what had to be done, not just for himself, but for everyone like him who had been quietly erased. The world moved on, as it always does. New scandals emerged, the news cycle shifted, and people slowly began to forget the face behind the breach. But late at night, on hidden message boards and encrypted chat rooms, his name still surfaced. Sometimes just as a whisper, sometimes as a warning. Marcus had become a myth in a world addicted to forgetting. And then, almost a year to the day after the broadcast, when the noise had died down and the public had returned to its rhythms, a video surfaced on a dark web channel known only to activists and whistleblowers. The screen flickered, and then the feed stabilized. Marcus appeared, hooded, his voice altered but unmistakably calm. "The fight isn't over," he said, staring into the camera. "What you saw was just the beginning. They haven't stopped. They've only gone deeper. They're watching again. And this time, they're hiding behind new names, new companies, new promises. But I'm still here. And I'm not done." The feed cut to black. The comments section exploded. And somewhere across the country, another envelope was dropped in another mailbox, marked with no return address, and a single word on the seal: truth.